Hunted by men who saw only profit and trophies in his sleek muscles and wild eyes, the black Mustang tore across the plains, fleeing bullets and lariats, heart pounding a thunderous rhythm as dust rose around him with each frantic stride. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. He plunged through the brittle grass, hoofs striking hard-packed earth, mane whipping in the wind. The sun glared down with a ruthless heat, as though fueling the pursuit from above, while the hunters closed in with grim determination. Their shouts echoed across the expanse, and the crack of a rifle made the stallion swerve violently, narrowly evading a bullet meant to drop him where he ran. Dry air caught in his nostrils, burning like fire as he sucked in breath after desperate breath, each exhale a tortured rasp. The Mustang's lungs screamed for relief, but there was none to be found on that searing plain. The men behind him were relentless, and their horses, though less swift, had stamina and a cruel intelligence behind them that threatened to corner him. His name, given to him by legend and whispered by those who had seen him cut across the horizon like an ebony streak, was Midnight. Some said he appeared from the darkness of a moonless night, though such stories were only hushed myths spread among ranchers. Others claimed he was a spirit of the desert incarnate, immune to the taming hands of man. That morning, as soon as the first shot blasted the still air, it became clear that, spirit or not, he was in mortal danger. The men pursuing him bore rifles slung across their backs and ropes coiled at their hips. They had come from distant towns, hearing tales of a wild black stallion that roamed free across the territories, unstoppable and unclaimed. They wanted that fabled freedom for themselves, in the form of a lifeless trophy, or to break his will beneath their saddles. It was sport for them, a savage challenge to defeat the untamed. Midnight darted around scrub brush, hooves skidding through loose soil. Each step tested the limits of his muscles, forcing him to rely on an unyielding survival instinct that simmered within him. A bullet whizzed past his flank, tearing a line in the air that made his heart jolt. He had outrun predators before, mountain lions, coyotes, the storms that thundered over the mountains, but never had he faced men so dogged in their intent. The difference was as stark as the rifle's muzzle. Man had tools, cunning, and cruelty that defied the natural order. While a lion hunted for sustenance, these hunters sought the thrill of breaking something wild and powerful. Midnight's instincts recognized the coldness in their determination, and terror throbbed in every vein. His chest heaved, and still he galloped, eyes rolling white in moments of panic, ears flat against the pounding of his own blood. The terrain was his ally, in some places. Craggy ridges rose, and gullies twisted like scars across the land. Cactus clusters and brush that snagged the men's horses gave the black stallion fleeting moments to gain distance. Yet the men followed with a predatory synergy. One rode ahead to cut him off, forcing Midnight to swerve right into the path of another. Together, they formed a living net of whips and shouts, closing in. Every now and then, one rifle would bark, and the shot would either clip the ground or sear the air too close to the Mustang's hide. He could feel the burn of near misses as they tried to bring him to his knees. In desperation, Midnight veered toward a low ridge of stone that jutted out of the earth. The ground fell sharply on the other side, forming a steep decline filled with jagged rocks and pockets of loose gravel. If he misstepped, a shattered leg would be certain death. He could sense the trap, but to turn away now meant charging back into the rifles. His lungs flared with exhaustion, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth as his tongue lolled. Still, he pressed on, hooves striking sparks on the stone as he scrambled to crest the ridge. He felt a bullet tear through his mane, so close it ruffled the thick black hair, and a whinny of fear escaped him. Behind, the men cheered, believing him trapped. He plunged downward, hooves slipping precariously on gravel. Above him, the riders pulled their horses to a stop at the edge, unsure whether to risk the slope. The Mustang half slid, half galloped, sending a plume of dust and small stones rattling in his wake. Sharp edges cut into his legs, scraping skin and drawing blood, but he stayed upright. The men found a narrower path, guiding their mounts in pursuit. They weren't as fast on foot, but they kept their rifles ready. The ravine floor was a tangle of thorn bushes and half-dead vegetation. Midnight leapt over a cluster of jagged branches, only to find himself face to face with a towering cactus. At the last second, he pivoted on hind legs and skirted around it, sides heaving, a trickle of crimson marring his sleek coat. Above, more shots rang out, ricocheting off the stone walls. One bullet shattered a chunk of rock next to him, sending splinters into the air. Another hissed past his ears. The acrid smell of gunpowder drifted through the canyon. He ran blindly, guided by fleeting hope rather than a plan, praying that somewhere beyond the next turn, he might find an opening. The sunlight overhead was now a scorching furnace, reflecting off pale stone to stab his eyes with painful glare. He tried to blink away the sting, fear thrashing wildly in his chest. His steps grew heavier with each frantic stride, but the noise behind him, men's voices, horses snorting, the echo of more rifle shots, kept him from slowing. A rope sailed over his head, its coil hissing through the air like a venomous serpent. He ducked instinctively, feeling the rope graze his ears before smacking the ground, missing by mere inches. The attempted lasso was reeled back and by its wielder, a tough-faced man with narrow eyes who cursed under his breath. Midnight had never felt such adrenaline surge through him. Every sense was on fire, each muscle straining to respond to danger. The men pressed closer, despite the treacherous terrain. A second rope soared, and this time it slapped across his flank. He kicked out violently, catching empty air but managing to jolt free. He bolted away before they could tighten the loop. His heart hammered, and he realized how drastically his speed was waning. The world spun in a haze of panic and exhaustion. Was this how he would die, shot down in a rocky canyon, his spirit broken by men who coveted that very spirit? Pain lanced his flank, and he thought for an instant he had been shot. But it was a barbed wire snag, a hidden remnant from ranch fencing left twisted and jagged in the ravine. He pranced backward, leg bleeding, eyes wild. The men's voices were even closer now. There was no time to disentangle with caution. With a desperate thrash, he tore free, leaving a trail of blood and black hair behind. The agony was sharp enough to momentarily blur his vision. A rumble of thunder in the distance echoed ominously along the ravine walls. Thick, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The merciless sun was about to be replaced by something equally dangerous, a brewing storm. Yet, for a moment, that possibility seemed like a distant concern compared to the immediate threat of rifles and ropes. The men paused, noticing the shift in the weather, but their pursuit did not falter. Midnight pressed forward, mind reeling with the single command, survive. The ravine took a sudden turn, narrowing into a bottleneck. The Mustang's ears twitched, picking up the faint roar of rushing water. This area was known for flash floods whenever storms unleashed their fury. He could still see sunlight flickering through the overhead gloom, but the sky was rapidly turning a leaden gray. Then he saw it, a shallow creek bed, usually dry, now carrying a thin trickle of water. The approaching thunder bellowed again, a promise of more. If the skies opened up, a wall of water could fill this ravine in minutes, a raging torrent of mud and debris that would sweep away man and horse alike. The men seemed aware of it, too. Their curses carried through the dampening air, urging each other to hurry before the storm broke. Midnight felt a small surge of dark hope. He knew these lands. He had traveled them in all seasons, enduring torrential rains that transformed gentle streams into raging rapids. If he could keep moving, maybe the land itself would provide a shield. Yet that hope was laced with dread. For a horse, being caught in a flash flood was just as lethal as a bullet. He needed higher ground, a route out of the canyon, somewhere the men couldn't trap him. He spotted a pathway that ascended the canyon's north face, a steep, winding route threaded with boulders. His lungs were aflame, and his left flank throbbed from the barbed wire cut, but he lunged for the slope. Loose stones tumbled under his hooves, threatening to send him sliding backward. Each lurching step cost him precious energy. The men realized his intention and scattered, some climbing from another angle, others remaining below to keep their rifles trained. A bullet hit the rocks near him, sparking a sudden clatter of stone. He startled, nearly losing his footing, but forced himself to keep going. The air felt charged with electricity now, the sky above swirling in dark clouds. Fat raindrops began to patter, sizzling on the heated stone. Lightning cracked, sending a blinding fork across the sky. The men's horses shied in fear, one nearly toppling its rider as thunder reverberated like a cannon shot. Taking advantage of their momentary distraction, Midnight gathered what remained of his strength and surged up the last stretch of rocky path. Wind whipped around him, carrying the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of impending fury. At the rim of the canyon, the storm winds assaulted him, ripping through his mane, but with each labored breath, he recognized the possibility of escape. If the storm made the terrain too dangerous for the hunters, they might hesitate, or better yet, lose track of him in the chaos. He just had to survive long enough to reach open land again. Behind him, the men continued, though some were obviously spooked. They yelled commands that got lost in the wind's howl, each man trying to coordinate a final push to capture or kill the Mustang before the storm unleashed its full wrath. The black stallion reached the crest and collapsed against the rocky edge, sides heaving, vision swimming. A jagged flash of lightning illuminated the scene for an instant. The men on horseback, dark silhouettes against the raging sky, rifled barrels glinting malevolently. Another shot cracked, the sound vibrating in his skull. He didn't feel the impact, but the close call jolted him to move. With trembling legs he bolted from the edge, bounding onto a plateau dotted with scraggly shrubs and scattering pebbles under his hooves. Rain fell in sheets now, stinging his coat, plastering his mane to his neck. The drumming of water on rock was like the pounding of war drums. Trails of dirt became slick mud, threatening to bring him crashing down if he ran too fast. His breath came in ragged gulps, and exhaustion weighed like an anvil on every muscle. Still, the shapes of riders appeared through the curtain of rain, shouts echoing. The men fanned out, determined and vicious. Midnight's ears twitched to the whistle of a bullet. This time, it struck the ground so close that the impact sprayed mud onto his hind legs. He stumbled, fighting against the skid. A fleeting thought crossed his mind. How many times can a creature cheat death before it claims him? He refused to surrender. Deep within, something primitive and defiant roared. This was his home, his life, and no man's bullet or rope would claim him easily. With a shake of his head that sent water spraying, he bolted toward a stand of twisted trees growing on a slope. They might offer shelter from bullets if not from the rain. The wind howled, gusts slamming into him, pushing him sideways. Lightning after lightning lit the world in stark white, each thunderclap a hammer blow to the senses. Mud sucked at his hooves, each stride an effort. As he neared the trees, they bent in the wind, branches snapping off. He ducked a falling limb, and then slipped, crashing onto his side with a splash of mud. Pain radiated from his flank where the barbed wire had cut him, the open wound throbbing in protest. For a moment, he lay there, panting, the warm mud enveloping him. Dark shapes loomed. The hunters had caught up. One of them hurled a rope, the loops spinning overhead. Midnight forced himself up, ignoring the agony that lanced his shoulder, and lashed out with his hind legs. The rope fell short. Another man tried. The loop grazed the Mustang's neck before falling away. He kicked out again, slipping on the muddy ground, refusing to yield. In the flicker of lightning, he saw the cold determination in their eyes. A thunderous roar came from the ravine behind them. They all paused, glancing back at the place they had just climbed. The storm water had gathered into a torrent, and now a flash flood tore through the canyon floor, carrying debris and churning brown water that slapped against the rocky walls. The men cursed. Their route back might be cut off. Still, they advanced on the Mustang. One man raised his rifle again, and Midnight braced for that final thunderclap of lead and steel. But a gust of wind tore across the plateau, flinging cold rain into the man's eyes, making his horse rear. The shot went wide, pinging harmlessly off a rock. Midnight seized the distraction, surging forward and hurtling toward a narrower path that wound higher into the hills. He sensed the men following, but the storm was in full fury now. He galloped across the soaked ground, heart in his throat, hardly seeing through the gray sheet of rain. At times he slipped, nearly toppling, but raw survival kept him on his feet. His leg burned where the barbs had torn it, The cut was worse than he wanted to admit, each stride a fresh wave of pain. Yet he ran. The men scattered behind him, their formation broken by the storm's chaos. Another rope was flung, and this time the loop tightened around one of his rear legs. A savage yank nearly sent him crashing to the ground. He whinnied, wild with terror, his muscles bunching as he kicked viciously, trying to snap the rope. Lightning flashed, revealing a grizzled man straining against the line, attempting to bring the Mustang down. Midnight's hooves churned up mud as he lurched forward, teeth bared in primal fury. He jerked his leg, felt the rope cut into flesh, but the man held firm. A second hunter arrived, raising a rifle. Midnight's eyes widened in absolute panic. He threw his weight to the side, yanking the rope holder off balance, and in that split second of confusion, he lashed out with both hind legs. The rope snapped. Freed, the Mustang lurched away as a gunshot split the air. He felt something hot graze his shoulder, a line of fire that made him scream. Pain threatened to drag him into darkness, but fear and desperation propelled him onward. A savage gust howled over the plateau, driving rain that stung like needles. He heard a hoarse shriek behind him. The men were having trouble controlling their mounts in the tempest. The Mustang limped now, each step a fresh agony. His vision blurred with rain and exhaustion, the environment spinning into a dizzying nightmare of thunder and lightning. But even as the storm raged, the land opened up ahead. He followed a faint memory of these hills, a hidden route behind a rocky formation that descended into a more sheltered valley. It was a risk to go downward again, closer to floodwaters, but if he stayed on the plateau, the hunters might box him in. The battered stallion made his choice, hooves sliding on wet rock as he started his descent. Mud cascaded in small rivulets around him, forming slick ribbons. He tensed at every step, praying the ground wouldn't crumble beneath him. Another shot rang out, though it sounded more distant this time, and he pressed forward. At last, he reached a narrow flat ledge that overlooked the valley below. The view was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The sky was black with storm clouds, rain lashing the earth, and in the distance, the crackling forks of lightning lit the horizon like ghostly veins. The valley floor was alive with churning water, the flash flood carving a path through brush and sand. He might find cover among the rocky outcroppings or be swept away if the water's path shifted. Yet he had no other option. The men were still behind him, though the storm had scattered them. He half scrambled, half slid down the slope. Stones tumbled around him, and in the darkness, his footing was uncertain. Each misstep threatened to send him tumbling. Wind tore at his mane, drowning out nearly all sound except thunder and his own desperate breathing. His flank burned as though on fire, blood and rain mixing into a pink wash that ran down his glossy coat. He could barely hold his head up, muzzle flecked with foam. Yet he pressed on, determined not to surrender his freedom. At the valley floor, the air was thick with moisture and the roar of swirling floodwaters. The ground was far from safe, water pooling in gullies and swirling around clumps of uprooted vegetation. He sidestepped a sudden eddy that nearly reached his hocks. Another memory took hold, a slope leading to a higher ridge on the other side, where an old bison trail cut through. It might be a way out of this deadly maze. He steeled himself, pushing past the ache in his bones. One step, then another. Lightning streaked across the sky again, casting everything in brilliant, stark light. He saw the swirl of debris-laden water just ahead, and beyond it, the faint outline of the slope. To cross meant entering the rushing flood. If he tried to go around, the men might catch him in a hail of bullets. There was no time to weigh better options. He waded forward, the current gripping his legs like a vice. Mud and broken branches swirled around him. He fought to keep his balance, eyes wide with mounting panic. The current pushed against his chest, and he felt his hooves sliding over the uneven ground. Gritting his teeth, he powered onward, water rising to his shoulders in the deeper section. In flashes of lightning, he saw the men at the edge of the valley, pointing in his direction. Rifles were likely ruined by the rain and mud, but that wouldn't stop them from trying to follow or cutting him off further along the slope. He was too exhausted to think of more than the next breath, the next step. The water felt glacial, draining the warmth from his body. His left foreleg wobbled, and he nearly sank, sputtering as the current sucked him downward. A twisting branch scraped across his face, leaving a welt. A groan that almost sounded human escaped his throat. He fought for every inch, battered by the storm, battered by the current, battered by the chase. Finally, his hooves struck more solid ground, the shallows on the far side of the flood. He stumbled out of the water, gasping, mud clinging to his legs. Every muscle in his body ached as though hammered. But he was alive, and on this side of the valley, the slope to the Bison Trail was within sight. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could vanish into the storm-blasted night. He turned his head, seeing the distant forms of the men. At least 2 of them had attempted to cross farther down. A swirl of water and debris forced them back. He watched them struggle, cursing the raging torrent that threatened to drown them. One horse reared, spooked by the current, nearly throwing its rider into the churning waters. Midnight realized with a jolt of fierce triumph that the storm had become an unexpected ally. Nature was fighting back against those who sought to end him. In the flash of lightning, their shapes looked small, desperate, and powerless against the boiling flood. He limped onward, focusing on the rocky slope. It was steep, with water coursing down its channels, turning the path slick as ice. Each step sent a jolt of pain through his leg, and the open wound on his flank throbbed in time with his heart. The downpour showed no signs of relenting, and gusts of wind battered him from the side. He slipped, skidding several feet, and nearly lost his balance. For a moment he braced himself, hind legs trembling, chest nearly touching the ground. Another clap of thunder crashed overhead, and the stallion willed himself upright, muscles straining. Step by step, he climbed, ignoring the shattered pain in his limbs. He was guided by the primal will to live. Reaching a small outcrop, he paused, chest heaving, eyes scanning the chaos below. The men were scattered, some yelling at each other to find a safer route, others frantically pulling horses from the rising waters. Lightning illuminated the ravine again, revealing piles of uprooted brush and logs crashing through the surge. Midnight glanced away, heart pounding with a strange mixture of relief and horror. Men or horse, the flood held no prejudice. It could drown them all. Above him, the slope continued, offering no guarantee of safety but at least the possibility of higher ground. He inhaled sharply, tasting blood and rain, and resumed the climb, each step an exercise in raw desperation. The wind cut across his soaked coat, turning every gust into a knife of cold. His ears lay flat against his skull, trying to protect them from the driving rain. Occasionally, he'd pause to catch a glimpse of lightning-lit silhouettes. The men still attempted to flank him, though they were forced to contend with nature's fury. A gunshot rang out sporadically, but the muzzle flashes were drowned in the deluge, and the shots themselves seemed to go wide, likely more an act of frustration than a real attempt to hit him. Midnight pressed against the slope, trying to vanish into the darkness, ignoring the shudder in his legs. Each passing minute felt like an hour. The sky's blackness was punctuated by flashes, thunder, and the unrelenting hammer of rain on stone. Eventually, he hauled himself over another ledge, stumbling onto flatter ground. Here, at least, the water drained away more efficiently, forming shallow streams that wound among rocks. Lightning revealed a rough trail that cut between boulders and disappeared around a bend. Midnight recognized it from his wanderings in better times, a path that meandered into higher grazing land, remote and seldom traveled. He had to get that far. Without rest, without pause, ignoring the pain that made him shiver uncontrollably, he continued. Each heartbeat reverberated through his battered body like a war drum urging him to keep going. The memories of sun-drenched fields and quiet starlit nights flashed through his mind, pushing him forward. The Mustang refused to let the grim reality of this chase devour him. He was more than muscle and speed. He was a living testament to the wild, an embodiment of freedom that only existed in open lands and unbroken spirits. The storm raged on, and somewhere behind him, men might still be trying to track him. But for the first time since the shot that started this nightmare, he began to sense a faint glimmer of hope. If nature's wrath separated him from those hunters, he had a chance to survive. Yet survival was not assured. Lightning could strike. Another bullet could find him. A misstep on the slick rock could send him plummeting to his death. Doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve, threatening to erode it like rain on sandstone. He pressed on, throat parched despite the rain, lungs aching like they might burst. The whistling wind tore away the scent of his own blood, replaced with the electrified smell of ozone and wet stone. Each step reminded him of the half-torn muscles in his flank. He could feel the slickness of fresh blood, warm against the cold downpour. He focused on that pain, letting it keep him conscious, preventing him from collapsing in the mud to wait for the end. The Mustang was no stranger to hardship. He had survived predators, scorching summers, and bitter winters, but never had his life been so perilously balanced between man's cruelty and nature's overwhelming might. With a defiant toss of his head, he pushed forward along the trail, vanishing into the sheets of rain and darkness. Time lost all meaning in that monochrome world of howling wind and staccato thunder. The storm felt eternal, each gust pressing against him, each lightning flash burning his retinas. His progress slowed, but he refused to stop, mind locked on the singular thought, escape. The plateau gave way to rolling terrain, the slope gentler, though still treacherous under the deluge. He pressed through a narrow passage between boulders, leaning into the wind that threatened to shove him back. The smell of wet sagebrush and churned earth curled through his nostrils, mingling with the ever-present tang of his own blood. He stepped onto a small stretch of relatively flat land, dotted with stunted trees and brush. In a blink of lightning, he saw the stark outline of a small oak, branches bent by the onslaught. He recognized this place vaguely. There was shelter ahead, an overhanging rock formation that might shield him from the worst of the storm. Hope flared, though it was tinged with the knowledge that the men could still be near. He limped toward that promise of cover, trembling with pain and exhaustion. Twice, he nearly slipped into a gully hidden by the darkness, catching himself at the last second. His sides shuddered, breath hitching, muscles quivering beneath his drenched coat. Each step was an act of will. At last, he saw the rocky overhang, a natural half-cave that offered some respite from the driving rain. He stumbled into the shelter, the space hardly large enough for a horse of his size. Still, it provided a partial shield from the wind and the downpour, the rock above deflecting the torrent. He stood there, chest still heaving, hardly believing he had made it this far. His ears twitched for any sounds of pursuit. The thunder rolled on, but the human voices and rifle shots were absent. Perhaps the storm had halted them or forced them to retreat for now. A glimmer of relief coursed through him, though he remained tense. Shifting his weight, he nearly collapsed from the pain in his leg. The barbed wire wound had clotted in the cold, but each movement threatened to reopen it. He huffed in pain, leaning against the rocky wall. Steam rose from his body in the chill air, and he lowered his head, allowing exhaustion to claim him for a moment. In that brief pause, he let the fear settle. The chase had been so relentless, so terrifying, that it felt unreal to have even a moment's reprieve. The storm continued to rage outside, lightning turning the world white in random flashes, thunder shaking the earth. Rain pounded the surrounding rocks, creating streams and puddles that glowed faintly when illuminated by the storm's electric bursts. Midnight's legs trembled, and he fought the urge to collapse entirely. His entire form shook with both cold and lingering adrenaline. He was alive, but for how long? He had no illusions. If the men regrouped, if they found a path through the storm, they might track him to this very spot. And even if they didn't, the raw slice on his flank could become infected, draining him of strength until he could no longer outrun anything. Still, he had survived thus far. In the gloom, he closed his eyes, letting the thunder lull him in an uneasy rest. Shreds of memory flitted across his mind, a time he had roamed freely with a small band of mustangs, running across grasslands under a golden sun. He remembered the muzzle of a mare gently bumping his flank, the playfulness in the herd as they galloped for the sheer joy of movement. No fences, no bullets, no fear. The memory felt like a dream from another life. That was freedom, and in his heart he clung to the hope that such freedom could be found again beyond this brutal night. A sudden flash illuminated a figure at the cave's mouth. Midnight's eyes snapped open, and he tensed, adrenaline surging once more. Had the men found him already? His muscles screamed protest as he prepared to bolt. But the figure moved on, a wind-driven branch or a swirl of shadows. Thunder crashed, shattering the silence. His breath came in shaky gasps, flanks heaving. When the darkness returned, he found no immediate threat. Still, sleep or rest was impossible with the storm raging. He remained half-conscious, ears rotating to catch any suspicious sound, heart hammering each time lightning turned the world into a stark, ghostly tableau. Eventually, the edge of the downpour seemed to recede ever so slightly. The torrential sheets became more of a steady roar, the thunder rolling farther away. Exhaustion weighted his eyelids, but terror kept him from fully letting go. He wanted to run, to put more distance between himself and the hunters. But his wounded body refused. Each shift of weight made him wince. So, for an endless stretch, he simply stood there, sides quivering, water dripping from his muzzle onto the stone floor. The wind howled less fiercely, though it still moaned in the distance, a reminder of nature's power. Occasionally, the stallion's head would droop, and his mind would drift, only to jolt back to alertness at the slightest sound of a gust or a shifting rock. At last, an eerie stillness settled, broken only by the drumming of rain that persisted, though softer now than before. Cautiously, Midnight poked his head out from under the overhang. The clouds still churned overhead, but the lightning came less frequently, the thunder more muted. He sniffed the air, detecting fewer scents of gunpowder. There was, however, the lingering odor of fear and sweat, the memory of men. The land had transformed into a saturated wasteland, rivulets of water carving channels through the earth. In the quiet, a distant neigh echoed. He froze, muzzle dropping as dread coiled in his gut. The men's horses were out there. Perhaps they had taken shelter as well, but their presence reminded him there was no guarantee of safety here. He had to move, no matter the pain. He stepped gingerly into the open, battered hooves squelching in mud. His flank felt stiff, the cut encrusted with dried blood and dirt. The slightest movement made him grit his teeth. Yet waiting for daylight would only risk being cornered. Now, in the residual dark with the storm still cloaking the land, there might be a chance to slip away undetected. He turned his nose to the wind, inhaling a wet, musky scent of churned soil and battered plants. There was no immediate smell of humans or their horses, though the direction of the wind made it uncertain. He staggered forward, the desire to reach higher ground again pushing him onward. The brush was waterlogged, leaves dripping and branches sagging, but it provided partial cover. Step by step, he forced himself up a slight incline, hooves sinking into the mud. Rain drizzled down in a constant patter, and the occasional flicker of distant lightning revealed the terrain. The urge to rest tugged at him with every breath, but fear of the hunters spurred him forward. He could not stay in that alcove until dawn. They might search systematically once the storm calmed. As minutes bled together in the half-dark, half-rain, he navigated by feel. The land here was less steep, though still strewn with boulders and gullies. Twice, he stumbled into a hidden creek. Icy water splashed up his legs, soaking him further, but he pushed on until the ground rose again. A memory stirred. If he continued northward, there was a region of dense brush and scattered rock formations that could obscure a horse from prying eyes. He had foraged there before, nibbling at sparse grass and shrubs. It wasn't ideal, but at least it offered places to hide. He had to trust his memory and the instincts that guided him. He limped painfully, each step an effort of will. His ears kept swiveling, alert for the slightest sign of pursuit. Now and then, a rumble of thunder echoed, but it seemed distant, receding into the east. The worst of the storm had moved on, leaving the ground slick and flooded in parts. A small rockslide dislodged nearby, sending stones clacking as they tumbled. Midnight froze, heart pounding anew, until the slide halted. No men appeared. Only the hush of rainfall persisted. He forged ahead. Though battered and drained, a small spark of defiance burned in his chest. He was not broken yet. At length, the terrain opened into a gentle slope covered in tenacious shrubs. The silhouette of a few twisted trees stood out against the ragged skyline. Midnight recognized them, a familiar vantage point overlooking a shallow valley. The brush there was thick enough to disappear in, especially under night's cloak and with the storm-laden skies above. If he could just reach it, find enough foliage to hide and rest, maybe daylight wouldn't find him in the hunter's crosshairs. He pressed on, ignoring the trembling in his legs that threatened to topple him with each laborious step. Rain continued to pelt him, though less fiercely, washing away some of the blood that trickled down his side. He finally reached the stand of brush, thick, tall growth that formed a natural barrier. Weaving his way deeper, he brushed against dripping leaves. Thorny branches snagged his coat, but he embraced the discomfort. The deeper he went, the more concealment he had. At last, he found a small hollow shielded on 3 sides by dense foliage and a boulder on the 4th. Though water still trickled down from above, it was relatively drier than being fully exposed. Collapsing to his knees, he fought off a wave of nausea from the exertion. His flank stung, reopened slightly by the movement. He turned his head, gingerly licking at the wound, though it brought scant relief. In the darkness, he could only sense the extent of his injuries, not truly see them. Exhausted, he lowered his head, body trembling, and surrendered to fitful half-sleep. Every muscle twitched, prepared to bolt at the slightest sound, but for now he rested. His dreams were a swirl of galloping hooves and thunder, that terrifying chase replaying over and over. He felt the rope closing around his throat, the bullets whizzing by, the men's laughter echoing. Then, in a surge of lightning, he was alone on the open prairie, under a sky filled with stars. The sudden contrast jolted him awake, heart hammering. Morning's gray light filtered through the damp leaves overhead. The rain had dwindled to a soft drizzle. He rose cautiously, wincing as his stiff muscles and wounds protested. Dawn approached, the sky clearing just enough to let in a hint of pale color. The storm had left behind a cool hush, as if the entire land held its breath. He sniffed the air, searching for any hint of men. Aside from the faint odor of horses on the wind, possibly from many miles away, he detected nothing immediate. Perhaps they had been driven off or slowed. Maybe they were still out there, combing the sodden landscape. He couldn't let his guard down. Hunger gnawed at his belly, but he dared not venture too far yet. Carefully, he peeked through the brush, scanning for movement. The storm's aftermath was evident: scattered debris, fallen branches, puddles everywhere. The sky, bruised purple and orange in the early light, seemed to watch in silence. An hour passed, or so it felt, and still he saw no sign of the hunters. Only the distant call of a bird, the drip of water from saturated leaves, and the gentle sigh of a damp breeze. Taking stock of his wounds, he realized the bullet graze on his shoulder had caked over with mud and blood, and the barbed wire slash on his flank was scabbed but raw. Every motion ached. Still, he rose fully, wanting to test his weight. He managed a few steps around the hollow, each one sending a ripple of pain through his side. But he could walk. He could move, if slowly. And that meant he could try to find a better hiding place, or at least seek water that wasn't flooding or swirling rapids. He emerged from the brush, ears pricked, and surveyed the land. Faint sunlight crept through the thinning clouds. Pools of water glimmered in every depression. Loose mud gave the earth a strange sheen, making each step risky. He limped toward a shallow pool near a fallen log, pausing to lower his muzzle and drink. The water tasted of soil and leaves, but it soothed his parched throat. He drank until his belly felt less hollow, scanning the horizon for any unnatural shapes. Nothing. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, the plain looked almost peaceful, if one ignored the churned mud and the lingering tension in the air. A memory of the hunters flickered in his mind, their determination, their callous hunger for the kill. He knew they could be searching even now, though the battered land might slow them. Time to move, to find more secure ground. He set off at a cautious trot, wincing at each impact of his hooves. The open areas made him nervous, too exposed. He angled toward a ridge where the vegetation grew thicker, half limping, half trotting. The wind shifted, carrying a faint, unsettling scent, the musty smell of sweaty horses. His heart lurched. They were nearby, or had passed recently. He froze, ears swiveling. A crow cawed overhead, perched in a shattered tree. The stallion caught no immediate sign of men, but the odor told him they had been here, or perhaps were just beyond sight. He chose a path that wove behind the ridge, keeping the high ground between himself and whatever lurked on the other side. Despite the pain, he hurried as fast as he dared, hooves squelching in the wet soil. Scrub and twisted juniper provided cover. He tested the air again, the scent of men weaker now. Maybe he was heading away from them. Relief and caution mingled. If luck favored him, they had given up or split up in confusion. But in the back of his mind, he knew they might only be temporarily thwarted. A part of him yearned for vengeance, to turn and face them with teeth and hooves. But he was not foolish. They had guns, ropes, the capacity for cruelty that animals lacked. Survival was his priority. As he ventured deeper behind the ridge, the ground dried marginally. Here, the sun filtered through breaks in the clouds, warming the damp earth. He sought a hidden place to rest, uncertain if his wounded flank could handle much more strain. A cluster of boulders lay ahead, forming a small pocket that might serve as temporary shelter. He approached, each step sending a dull throb up his leg. His breath came shallow, muscles still taut with fear. Upon reaching the boulders, he found a narrow space between them, enough to conceal his bulk from prying eyes if he lay down. Carefully, he slid in, turning his body so his flank wouldn't scrape the stone. The ground there was damp but more stable, scattered with pebbles rather than mud. He lowered himself, knees folding beneath, and collapsed into an uneasy rest. He could not fully sleep, but he let his eyes close, ears on alert. Each gust of wind rustling the bushes made him twitch, expecting a gunshot at any moment. For a time he dozed, consumed by half-formed dreams of galloping unbound under a vast starry sky. Then a noise jolted him, pebbles clattering. He snapped his head up, ears pricked, heart hammering in his chest. The sunlight was brighter now, the storm clouds drifting away. Every shadow felt dangerous. He heard the soft snort of a horse, not his own. Carefully, as silent as possible, he craned his neck to peer through a gap between rocks. On the far side of the ridge, maybe 100 yards away, 2 men on horseback searched the brush. Their clothes were spattered with mud, rifles slung across their backs. One had a rope coiled at his hip. Midnight's heart pounded so loudly, he feared they might hear it. The men dismounted, examining the ground. They argued in low voices, the occasional word drifting across the space. The Mustang recognized their frustration. They were likely looking for tracks, signs of the stallion's passing. The saturated earth would reveal hoofprints, but the storm's pounding rain had also washed or muddled many signs. One man gestured angrily, pointing in various directions, while the other scoured the brush. Midnight held his breath, body rigid. If they climbed the ridge, they could easily spot him wedged in these rocks, pinned like a cornered animal. He dug at the ground with his forehoof, ready to leap up if it came to that, though he doubted he could outrun a bullet in his current condition. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. The men, uncertain, eventually mounted their horses again. One spat on the ground, muttering curses about the damned storm and, "That demon horse?" The mention of demon horse confirmed they were still after the black stallion rumored to be unstoppable. Midnight watched them turn away, riding further down the slope to a cluster of trees. He did not dare move for a long time, not until they were well out of sight. He listened to their voices fade, replaced by the rustling wind. Then, carefully, he rose, muscles protesting fiercely, and backed out of the cramped space. They hadn't given up. They were circling the area, determined to finish what they started. He needed to distance himself from this place, find a route that took him out of their radius entirely. North lay a wide stretch of badlands, rocky and barren, but also riddled with canyons and hidden washes where a horse could disappear if he knew the terrain. Midnight had roamed there, though it was harsh land with sparse water. Yet it might be his only chance. Grimly, he turned his muzzle in that direction. Pain flared with each step, but he forced himself onward, mindful of keeping the ridge between him and the hunter's last known location. With the storm gone, the sky started to clear, revealing the sun climbing toward midday. Heat would soon return, baking the soaked earth, turning mud into thick clay that would cling to his hooves. The Mustang recognized he had limited time before the day's glare made him more visible. He pressed forward, carefully picking his way through brush and rock. The morning wore on. Every so often, a gust of wind carried the faint echo of men's shouts, but they never drew close enough for him to see them again. Each distant sound of movement tightened the knot of fear in his chest. Yet he kept moving, forging a path deeper into remote land. By midday, he stood on the edge of a high bluff overlooking a desolate canyon. The storm's floodwaters were draining out through this canyon as well, leaving behind slick mud banks. Jagged rock formations, shaped by centuries of wind and erosion, jutted in all directions. The land below was a labyrinth of gullies and ridges, a place where even the most determined pursuers could lose a trail. He began the cautious descent, knowing one slip could send him tumbling. He tested each foothold, wincing as the rough terrain aggravated his wounds. Occasionally, a rivulet of blood trailed down his flank, his scab torn by movement. He pressed on, half lamed but fueled by that unbreakable survival instinct. The air here felt heavy, thick with the smell of wet stone. Vultures circled lazily overhead, black silhouettes against the brightening sky. Their presence rattled him, as if they anticipated a feast. He snorted in defiance, refusing to become carrion. The hours blended together in slow, painful motion. The wound on his flank would not let him forget how close he had come to capture. The Mustang navigated narrow trails, jumped small washes, and splashed through muddy channels still draining the storm's fury. After what felt like an eternity, the canyon spread into a broader basin. Sparse desert flora dotted the ground, gnarled shrubs scattered cacti. The midday sun beamed relentlessly now, the puddles sizzling into steam. Midnight's dark coat absorbed the heat, adding another layer of misery to his ordeal. Thirst struck him hard, and he pawed at the dirt near a shallow puddle, only to find tepid, muddy water. Desperate, he drank enough to wet his tongue, then pressed on. A faint track wound eastward, possibly an animal trail. He followed it, eyes scanning for any movement that might indicate the hunters. The land felt eerily quiet, as though reeling from the storm. Dried grass lay flattened, entire sections of desert scoured by wind and rain. This emptiness made him uneasy, for the men could be anywhere. He considered doubling back, but that would risk encountering them if they too were exploring these canyons. Instead, he kept to the trail, each step leaving a faint imprint in the moist earth that dried rapidly behind him. At last, he found a place that offered a semblance of security, a natural alcove formed by an overhanging rock face, high enough to keep him hidden from casual view, with a small patch of grass that had sprung to life from the storm's moisture. Though still on alert, he let himself rest there, muzzle lowered to nibble at the fresh blades. The green tasted sweet after so much desperation. His battered body sank to the ground, exhaustion taking over. For once, he allowed his eyes to close in the warmth of the midday sun, trusting the rocky overhang to conceal him from prying eyes. Each breath rattled his aching ribs, but he found a sliver of calm. The storm had passed, the men were scattered, and for a moment, he felt the ghost of freedom brush against him. Yet safety was fragile. As the sun moved across the sky, he jolted awake to the crack of a distant gunshot. Panic spiked in his chest. He scrambled upright, ears darting, searching for the direction. The echo bounced off canyon walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. Fear twisted in his gut. They were out there still, and they had fired at something. Possibly they had sighted him from afar, or were shooting at another creature that crossed their path. He debated bolting immediately but forced himself to remain hidden, peering past the boulders for any sign. Nothing moved in the shimmering heat. Still, the shot reminded him that he couldn't linger. He decided to head deeper into the Badlands, where the ground grew more fractured, forming mazes of ravines. He knew water would be scarce there, but if he kept going, the men would struggle to follow without risking their horses. With renewed caution, he slipped out from the alcove and resumed his trek. Each step was deliberate, scanning the ridgelines for silhouettes. A crow's caw made him jump, nerves frayed beyond measure. He forced himself onward, wrestling with fatigue and pain, acutely aware that any moment could bring confrontation with the hunters. The blazing sun reached its zenith, punishing him with heat, searing the wet earth below. Steam rose in ghostly wisps, the humidity clinging to him. Flies began to buzz, drawn to the dried blood on his flank. He flicked his tail irritably, but the motion aggravated his wound. Each second, the possibility of survival felt more precarious, yet he pressed on, refusing to yield to despair. The land changed as he went, the canyons becoming narrower, the rock walls higher, the paths trickier. At one point, he navigated a narrow ledge along a red stone cliff, swallowing his instinctive fear, because the only other route was a wide-open expanse where he'd be easily spotted. The ledge crumbled beneath a hind hoof once, sending a spray of rocks down a dizzying drop. Terror hammered in his chest, but he regained his footing, scraping his flank against the cliff face. New pain flared, but he had no choice but to continue. Finally, the path widened, descending into a hidden pocket of land flanked by towering buttes. A dusty wash wound through the center, dotted by hardy desert plants. A large cottonwood tree stood near a trickle of water, its leaves trembling in the afternoon breeze. Midnight approached it carefully, sniffing the air for danger. The water was shallow but clear enough to reflect the azure of the sky that had finally emerged from behind the storms. Grateful for the chance to drink, he waded in, ignoring the burn of the cuts on his legs when they touched the cool water. He drank deeply, feeling some strength return. If the hunters were near, there was no immediate sign. The only sound was the wind rustling through the cottonwood leaves. His reflection rippled on the water's surface. A black stallion with matted hair, caked mud and blood, eyes wide with lingering terror. He scarcely recognized himself, but a flicker of that old pride stirred. He had survived an impossible night. His body might be broken and scarred, but his spirit remained unclaimed. He gazed at the rocky walls around him, the twisted layers of sediment. This was wild land, shaped by eons of wind and rain, untamed like he was. Maybe, just maybe, he could remain hidden here until his wounds healed. He tested the air again, still detecting no immediate threat. His eyes swept the canyon walls for any sign of men on the ridges. Taking a few more steps, he found a small rise near the cottonwood where the ground was dry enough to rest. Carefully, he lowered himself, tucking his legs beneath him. Pain radiated, but he breathed it away. The afternoon sun baked his coat, beginning to dry the mud. Flies still buzzed, though a flick of his tail and the occasional twitch of skin kept them from settling too long. He listened to the wind, to the trickle of the water, to the beat of his own heart, as he tried to calm the frantic rhythm of his thoughts. The memory of those cold, determined eyes and the crack of rifles haunted him. Whenever a branch snapped or a bird took flight, his head jerked up, anticipating danger. The hours drifted. Clouds scudded across the sky, casting shifting shadows over the canyon. Hunger gnawed at him, a reminder that he hadn't properly eaten since before the storm. He tore clumps of grass near the water's edge, chewing slowly, ignoring the dryness in his mouth that made it hard to swallow. Each swallow stung, but he forced the nourishment down. Then he returned to the shallow water, sipping intermittently as he watched the canyon entrance. The world seemed hushed, as though holding its breath, waiting to see if the black stallion's struggle would continue. Overhead, vultures circled again, a distant foreboding. He might have dozed off in the warm sun, lulled by the soft rustle of leaves, because he suddenly woke to the echo of a stone shifting on the canyon rim. His muscles tensed, and he rose, ears alert. A silhouette passed along the edge, far above him, a horse and rider. His heart pounded. Had they found him again? He stood motionless, pressed against the cottonwood trunk, dark coat blending with the tree's shadow. The rider lingered for a moment, scanning the canyon floor, then urged his horse onward. Midnight held his breath. The man did not descend, did not appear to spot the stallion by the water. Relief warred with panic in his veins. They were too close, far closer than he'd hoped. This canyon was not as secret as it looked. He realized then that he couldn't stay. The hunters might split up and search every nook. If they descended, he'd be trapped. Slowly, so as not to make noise, he backed away from the water's edge, returning to the dusty wash. Clinging to the canyon walls, he followed a narrow channel that led deeper into the labyrinth. His leg quivered with fatigue, but adrenaline forced him to keep going. The walls rose high around him, offering concealment, but also the danger of a dead end. He listened for voices or hoofbeats, hearing only the faint sigh of the breeze. Step after agonizing step, he traversed the labyrinth of stone, praying for a hidden exit or a series of branching paths to throw off his pursuers. The canyon twisted unpredictably, revealing dried waterfalls, pockets of vegetation, and clusters of boulders. His sense of direction faltered. He only knew he wanted to keep moving away from where he last saw that rider. Occasionally, he'd find a shallow puddle to drink from, or mouth a leaf from a scrubby plant. He had lost track of how many hours passed since dawn. The sun sank lower, painting the canyon walls in warm orange. The heat subsided. He paused once to stand in the lengthening shadows, eyes searching the top of the walls for watchers. Still no sign. The hush of evening descended, accompanied by the faint chirp of insects. Perhaps the men had abandoned the chase for the day, or maybe they had lost him entirely, battered by nature's fury. He dared not assume. Pushing on, he came across a portion of canyon where the walls had collapsed in a rockslide, forming a precarious slope of broken stone leading upward. It might be a way out if it led to the open desert. He tested the first few steps, stones clattering beneath his hooves. It was steep and unstable, but his other option was to remain in the canyon, with only one or two uncertain exits that might end in a hunter's ambush. Summoning his will, he began the climb, wincing as his flank rubbed against the protruding rocks. Blood seeped anew, trickling down his leg in the faint light. He paused often, resting as best he could, muzzle quivering with pain. Each time he shifted his hindquarters, a fresh bolt of agony shot up his side. But to remain was certain doom if the men returned. He kept going. The sun dipped behind the canyon rim, casting the rockslide into deep shadow. His breathing grew labored, footsteps echoing in the stillness. He knocked loose a small avalanche of stones that bounced into the canyon below, the noise reverberating. He froze, ears craned, listening for any reaction, any shout or gunshot. None came. Warily, he continued. At last, his head crested the rim, and he emerged onto a gently sloping plateau scattered with mesquite and prickly pear. The dying sun painted the western sky in a riot of pink and gold. A breeze grazed his face, cooler than the stifling canyon air. He stood panting, scanning the surroundings. It looked empty, vast. Dusk would soon cover the land, offering partial concealment if he traveled further. He tested the wind, smelling only the faint aroma of wet earth and distant sage. No humans. With a trembling sigh, he picked his way through the scrub, heading north again. His eyes roamed the horizon for any sign of movement. All seemed silent, the calm after the storm. He limped onward, passing a lone cactus standing sentinel in the desert twilight. He almost felt a pang of sorrow for leaving the canyons behind, but caution dictated he distance himself from wherever he'd glimpsed that rider. Another night was descending, cold but free of the raging thunder and lightning that nearly killed him. The wound on his flank still oozed slightly, and he knew infection was a threat. But he was alive. Each breath he took in the gathering night felt like defiance against the men who sought to end him. Stars blinked awake in the darkening sky. He paused to gaze upward, heart stirring at the familiar pattern of constellations. Among them, he imagined he saw the shape of a running horse, wild and eternal, unbound by any rope or fence. A pang of longing for his herd lanced through him. Had they been scattered by storms or men? Perhaps they roamed safer lands, unaware of his plight. He pressed on, each step measured, guided by the faint starlight. The temperature dropped, wind whispering through brittle brush. Ghostly shapes of rocks loomed in the half-light. Despite the pain, he felt something akin to hope, a sense that maybe he was beyond the hunter's reach at last. The night deepened, and exhaustion dragged at his limbs. Finally, spotting a shallow depression beside a large boulder that might offer some warmth from the wind, he settled down to rest. He lay on his uninjured side, muzzle resting on the ground, breath easing in slow, quivering draws. The sense of reprieve was profound, though anxiety still lurked in the back of his mind. His leg throbbed, and the open slash on his flank felt hot to the touch. He closed his eyes, muzzle damp from the minimal grazing and drinking he'd managed. Sleep came fitfully, filled with half-dreams of stampeding hooves and the rumble of thunder. When dawn broke, the air was chilly, the sky paling to a soft gray before the sun peeked over the horizon. He rose gingerly, testing his battered body. The stiffness was worse, the cut on his flank swollen. But he could still walk. The desert around him was silent except for the occasional rustle of a small creature scuttling in the underbrush. He set out again, hoping to find a water source in these dry flats. The hunt was never far from his mind. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see men emerge, rifles gleaming in the new light. Yet the horizon remained empty, and only the quiet hush of morning accompanied his tentative steps. By midday, he reached a low ridge overlooking a parched valley. The storm had reached even here, evident in the patches of dried mud and water-filled crevices. A smattering of stunted grass clung to life, and he grazed on it, ignoring the gritty taste. The sun was climbing, bringing heat that made him sweat. He missed the shade of cottonwoods, but at least the dryness might help keep his wound from festering in perpetual dampness. After taking the edge off his hunger, he wandered down the ridge into the valley floor, searching for any depression that might still hold water. He found one in the shadow of a rocky overhang, a small puddle left by the storm. It was murky, but he drank. Evening arrived without sign of hunters. The desert grew still, the sky streaked with oranges and purples. The wind carried no trace of men, only the whisper of sage and mesquite. Midnight began to think they might have retreated, that the fury of the storm and the treacherous terrain had forced them to concede defeat. A careful optimism seeped into his weary bones. He ventured onward day by day, each sunrise bringing a gradual healing to his torn flank. He still limped, but the leg wound scabbed over, and his strength grew in small increments. He used the land's sparse resources, nibbling desert grass and sipping from hidden seeps. Each day he traveled farther north, forging deeper into uncharted wilderness. Still, caution remained his companion. The memory of those men, their eyes glinting with excitement, their guns promising death, lingered in his thoughts. He avoided large open areas when possible, hugging rock formations and gullies. He learned to rest only in hidden spots, half dozing, always prepared to run. The desert nights were cold, yet the pain in his shoulder and flank kept him awake more than once. Time blurred, the chase feeling more distant but never forgotten. His body carried scars now, both fresh and old. The flash of barbed wire crossing his flesh had left a vivid reminder of the brutality he'd faced. At last, after what felt like an eternity of wandering, he climbed a ridge that revealed a wide plateau stretching to distant mountains. Grasslands dotted the horizon, healthier than the desert scrub. Patches of green shimmered in the sunlight, beckoning with the promise of better grazing. Despite the ache in his body, he felt a surge of longing. If he could reach that grassland, perhaps he could truly recover. He descended the ridge slowly, carefully, the midday sun hot overhead. The air carried a hint of moisture, possibly a stream or creek in the distance. That night, he sheltered under a lone juniper, dozing in and out of uneasy sleep. No sign of men, no gunshots. Each passing day without their presence was a balm to his ragged nerves. Wounds could heal, but the memory would persist. He sometimes spooked at the sound of a snapping branch or a distant echo. Yet with each sunrise he dared to hope that the hunters had lost interest or become victims of the storm's wrath. Perhaps they were stranded, forced to return home empty-handed. Part of him wished that the flood had washed them all away, punishing them for their cruelty. But the Mustang's nature was not vengeful. He only sought to live free from the menace of ropes and bullets. Finally, he stepped onto soft grass, a sensation so comforting it nearly brought a trembling relief. The plateau opened before him, gently rolling, dotted with wild flowers and patches of taller grass. A shallow stream ran across it, the water running clear beneath the newly bright sky. He hobbled to the bank, muzzle dipping to drink. The sweet taste of fresh water rejuvenated him. As the day wore on, he grazed, the tension in his muscles gradually easing. For the first time since that fateful shot rang out, he could almost breathe without fear constricting his chest. The days that followed were a slow but steady recovery. He explored the plateau, favoring his injured leg, but regaining some measure of strength. He found hidden nooks by rock outcroppings to sleep, safe from prying eyes. The bullet grazed on his shoulder, scabbed over, leaving a ragged patch where the hair would forever be marred. The barbed wire slash on his flank slowly sealed, forming a scar that ached in cold weather. Yet the black stallion was alive, his spirit unbroken. He could trot now, though not yet gallop without pain. Sometimes, in the quiet of dusk, he tested his stride, feeling the wind in his mane, remembering that old sense of freedom. A few tentative steps at a canter, then a twinge of pain forced him to slow. Patience would guide his healing. Each night, the stars blanketed the sky, and he dozed, ears flicking at the faintest sound. He was still hunted in his mind, ever wary, but no evidence of pursuit emerged. The land seemed empty of that human menace. Perhaps they had truly given up. Perhaps they scoured other territories or were deterred by rumor of a savage storm that claimed the canyons. Midnight did not care to dwell on their fate, only on his own survival. In time, he resumed grazing more fully, forging a small routine. He'd drink at the stream in the early morning, then move uphill to browse on the fresh growth brought forth by the storm's water. Evenings, he'd find shelter near a stand of pines on the plateau's edge. His limp lessened, though it never disappeared entirely. The quiet days stretched on, unbroken by the crack of rifles. The only echoes in the valley were the wind and the distant calls of other wildlife. Sometimes he glimpsed antelope bounding across the grass, or a coyote skulking along a rocky ledge. Life thrived, unbothered by the memory of that hunt. Slowly, the black stallion allowed himself to trust in the possibility that nature had fought back, sending the hunters away empty-handed. The monsoon-like storm, the flash floods, the treacherous canyons, it all might have conspired to protect him from those who took pleasure in cruelty. He tested his strength, cantering for short bursts. His flank still ached, but the speed thrilled him, reminding him of days gone by. He let the sun warm him, the breeze combed through his mane. The scars were real, but so was his will to live, to remain unbroken. Morning light painted him in a golden halo, black coat gleaming with renewed health. Sometimes, the memory of gunshots jolted him awake from nightmares, but each dawn that arrived without men on the horizon soothed that fear a little more. The echoes of pain and panic would linger, but he would not let them define him. Eventually, when he felt strong enough, he ventured in a wide circle, exploring the far reaches of the plateau. He discovered a path leading into higher country, a land of rolling hills and pockets of forests. The grass was greener there, the water clearer. If the men were gone, perhaps he could roam without looking over his shoulder. Cautiously he advanced, constantly vigilant. He found no footprints, no horseshoe marks, no broken branches left by men. Only deer prints and the faint tracks of predators. The land welcomed him, silent and wild. In the hush of a summer sunrise he galloped, truly galloped, for the first time since the chase. His heart soared with the thunder of his hooves, even though the wound tugged painfully at his flank. He reveled in the motion, the sheer power of being alive in the open, free from fences and bullets. A time came when he stood on a ridge overlooking the expanse below, recalling the storm and the nights of terror. He had outrun them all, man, bullet, and lightning. Nature's fury had intervened, turning on the hunters in a way they had never expected, flooding canyons and turning the chase into a deadly trap for those who underestimated the land's power. He was no longer the same horse who started that flight. A new scar marred his coat, but an unbreakable spirit burned in his eyes. He had stared down death and emerged on the other side with a deeper understanding of the wild's brutal balance. He lifted his muzzle to the wind, inhaling the scent of pine and grass. He had a second chance now. Perhaps the hunters, if they still lived, would spin tales of the black stallion that no bullet could claim, of the night the desert storm took vengeance on them for their cruelty. The Mustang snorted softly, as though dismissing them to the dusty pages of legend. He turned away from the vantage point, moving on to a life no longer defined by fear. His future lay under open skies, guided by the currents of wind and the promise of freedom on new horizons. He might remain watchful, but he would never again let the memory of cruelty shackle him. If you stayed with us through this entire struggle, thank you for witnessing the resilience of a creature that refused to be broken. If this story reminded you of the unyielding will we all carry in moments of danger, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that survival is possible even in the darkest storms. Let us know in the comments how this journey impacted you, and join us again for more tales of courage and second chances. We upload every day at the same time. Until next time, stay safe and keep chasing that horizon.